Hey all, Dale here, and in this video we're going to show you how we transformed this beautiful chessboard table from an old, well-used and worn out live edge pine slab table that our client Nibbana Café gave us. They were looking to create a relaxing and an entertaining atmosphere in their sit-down cafe at the Western Ave Studios in Lowell, Massachusetts. So we created a functional coffee and gaming table. We ended up trying out a new technique for their logo, and wowza, it is eye-catching. CNC sign makers, you're going to want to watch this. We started out by leveling the surface on the CNC. This will give us a nice clean slate to begin with. We used a 1-inch leveling bit for this. Next, we used a rugged black enamel elixir paint. This is a high quality paint that's really easy to apply. Just shake it in the bag, pour it on top, and spread it evenly over the surface. It does self-level. You might notice the air purifier that turned red as I was painting. This indicated the rising TVOCs in the air were rising. When you're using epoxy, paint, or finishes, you want to make sure you're in a well-ventilated area and wear a chemical respirator when you're working with these. Once the paint is dry, we'll run the job on the CNC. We just marked the center of this with painting tape. Then covered the two areas where the logo is going to go with a vinyl mask used for CNCs. You'll find a tool and material list in the description below. Here, we're using a 60-degree V-carve bit to carve out the logo. It has some really cool 3D details, and we wanted to make sure we captured those. Next, we changed to a 1/4-inch downward spiral bit to carve out the chessboard. To highlight the details in the 3D carved logo, we're going to add a pigment powder directly to the wood. You want to use a metal leaf adhesive sizing material to any surface you want the pigment to stick to. This just might become your new favorite technique to add colors to your 3D CNC signs. Once the sizing has turned clear in about 10 to 15 minutes, we can add our pigments. High quality color shifting pigment powders work best for these 3D carvings as it really enhances the details. Just dip a clean, dry brush right into the powder and brush onto your carving. You want to get that brush right into all the details. Small strokes back and forth and in circular motions, making sure the entire surface is completely covered. Now, if I was doing a medium to a dark pigment, I would have painted the engraving first in either a similar color or black, as this will really enhance that finished pigment color. You would want to do this and let it dry before you add the sizing. Now let this completely dry overnight. We are going to be adding a clear epoxy to this, and you don't want any floaters. So use an air compressor to blow out any excess pigment powder. Now slowly peel the mask off. Take your time removing the mask from the inside of the letters, being careful not to chip the paint. This is probably my least favorite part of the entire project. Now we're going to seal everything with shellac. This is going to prevent any air bubbles from forming inside the bare wood of the checkerboard as well as keep any pigment powder from floating around. Add risers to the bottom of your table. Make sure it's stable and check for level. Make adjustments if necessary. Once the table is level, clean any dust off the top. Baby wipes work great for this. Mix up your epoxy and pigments and slowly pour it in the center of each wood square. Be sure to wipe the cup to prevent dripping onto the painted area. We used a maker epoxy for this because it has a longer pot life and will need that extra time. It's very important that you underfill the squares. We're not going to be sanding this flat, so let the epoxy flow outward on its own. You can carefully add a little more wherever it's necessary. Now use a quick swiping motion with a butane torch to pop any bubbles. You can use a toothpick or a pointed silicone brush carefully to move the epoxy into any areas if needed. These are all filled just below the table surface. It's vital that the epoxy does not spill over onto the paint. If you do get a drop or a slight spillage, then you're going to wipe it up with a baby wipe. We're now going to fill the logo with clear epoxy. An epoxy syringe would be a lot easier to do this, but I didn't have one, so I'm just going to pour. Filling this with your clear now is going to help reduce the bubbles later. Try to only fill the carving. It doesn't have to be to the top. Some spillage is okay. I just use my silicone brush to remove it as best as possible. Don't stress though, since we are going to be covering the entire table with a tabletop epoxy. That will end up self-leveling in the end. You're going to want to let this completely dry for at least 24 to 48 hours. We're going to do a thin leveling layer of tabletop epoxy. For this, I really like to use my gloved hands to ensure an even layer, especially around the edges and the corners. Once this is done, you're going to let this dry for 48 hours. We really want a solid surface before we start sanding. In a previous video, someone commented for me to remind you to use a mask when you're sanding epoxy, and I really appreciate that, so here's your reminder. Oftentimes, you'll find sharp edges and uneven sides where drips might have formed. I'm just going to hand sand this smooth, as this is the thinnest epoxy areas and we don't want to sand the paint off. Using a 320 grit sandpaper, I'm just going to sand the entire top. This way, I might be able to feel for any bumps or ridges. Then use an air compressor to remove all the dust particles. Do this before you wipe down with anything that's wet. Otherwise, you're going to cement that dust into those scratches. Okay, now wipe clean. Here I'm using a clean rag and denatured alcohol. Leave no dust behind. These extra steps are definitely worth it in the long run. Same deal, table on risers and check for level. Now add a thicker layer of tabletop epoxy. If you do a quick hit with a butane torch, it'll spread better. I'm really working this epoxy in, concentrating on the edges and the sides. Epoxy likes to flow where epoxy already is. By spreading this with my hands, I'm ensuring that those sides are evenly coated. With a tabletop epoxy, you only have about 30 minutes to do this. Use an art epoxy like Maker Epoxy if you need more time. Now I can add the rest of my epoxy, and again, concentrate around the edge. This will all self-level, especially when you hit it again with a butane torch. Now let this dry for 2 to 3 days. You really want to make sure your surface is solid before we have to turn it over and remove the drips off the bottom. To remove these, we're just going to use an old metal chisel and a heat gun. Once done, you want to let this cool thoroughly, and then you can sand it smooth. And here it is. I really enjoyed this project, and the customers love it. I have to say my favorite part is the logo. The camera does not do this justice, but it is amazing. Leave a comment below if you have a favorite color combination for a chessboard. Don't forget to like and hit that subscribe button to see more projects like this one. We'll see you next time.